The UFC has its rules, and when one goes against them, consequences follow. For example, one could get their belt stripped for something that went against the rules. That must make you curious about which of the UFC champions got their belt stripped. Well, there was one who signed with Vale Tudo Japan, and that's the story of Randy Couture. Back in 1998, he had just become the heavyweight champion, and no wonder he was in demand at that point. But this being in demand cost him his title. Yes, that's right. Let me tell you the complete story. So what happened was that Randy had just won the title, and he was definitely set for more fights to come in the UFC. However, he did the unexpected and signed with Vale Tudo Japan instead, probably because he was offered more money there. But, well, whatever it was, it surely ended very badly. The UFC immediately stripped him of his title as a heavyweight champion, and he wasn't allowed to be a part of it while he was still with Vale Tudo Japan. But yes, there was a happy ending though. A few years later, he left Vale Tudo and rejoined UFC. After rejoining, he won several titles and is known as one of the best UFC fighters to have existed. But Couture wasn't the only one who signed with another fighting organization. Murilo Bustamante did the same. Okay, so the story of Murilo Bustamante is also quite similar to what we see in Couture's story. In 2002, after Murilo won the middleweight title and also defended it later, he received several offers. One of these many offers was from Pride, and well, he did what he wished to. Murilo was reported to have signed with Pride, but the UFC couldn't take it, and they stripped him of his title. He never returned to the UFC though. Instead, he became a mixed martial artist. At the moment, he's enjoying his life after retirement.
It's a very good system that people have their own questions.
Wait, the list doesn't end here. Tim Sylvia also got stripped of his title. Back in 2003, Tim Sylvia defended his title as the heavyweight champion against Gan McGee. Well, he defended the title, but couldn't keep it for long, since his post-fight drug tests didn't go well. This also became the reason why there were two champions stripped of the title twice in the same year. Later, he went on to launch an entire Twitter campaign since he wanted to return to the UFC. This was a kind of plea to UFC President Dana White, hoping he'd pay some attention, but nothing really worked. Today, he works as a project manager for a roofing company, and once again, he isn't the only one. Josh Barnett also paid the price of using drugs. Barnett was the one to win the heavyweight champion title from Randy Couture at the age of 36. But the dilemma was that he couldn't give up drugs. Not once, but twice. His post-fight drug tests didn't come out well. For the first time, he was warned, but the warning didn't work for him, and the second time, he was finally stripped of his title and was let go of the UFC. After this incident, he moved to Japan and fought in several promotions. In 2022, he was seen working as a commentator for NJPW's weekly program on AXS TV, and later that year, he also started wrestling. Not just that, these tales don't end with Barnett's. Frank Mir also had his belt stripped. He won the vacant heavyweight title after breaking Sylvia's arm, but this celebration didn't last long. Right after that fight, it was reported that Frank Mir had gotten into a motorcycle accident, and this put him to rest for over 2 years. Mir didn't actually do anything wrong, but the UFC couldn't wait for long, and they stripped him of the title. After 16 years in the UFC, he recently competed for Bellator MMA in the heavyweight division. With that said, there's someone who was stripped of the title twice. You guessed it right, I'm talking about Jon Jones. In 2015, Jon Jones defeated Daniel Cormier, and this ended up being one of his biggest performances ever.
There it is! But Jon Jones springs right back up to his feet.
But later, he got into a car accident, and ironically enough, he ran away from the scene. This caused a major issue, and the UFC stripped him of the title as he had violated the Code of Conduct policy. In 2016, he regained his light heavyweight title after fighting against Ovince St. Preux at UFC 197. After that, he was set to fight against Daniel Cormier at UFC 200, but right then, he was tested positive for steroids, which ultimately led the UFC to strip strip off the title once again. Not to mention, there's another famous name that made it to this list. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Conor McGregor. At UFC 205, he won the lightweight title after fighting against Eddie Alvarez. At that point, he was holding 2 titles of lightweight and featherweight. He had promised to defend these titles, but he ended up taking off to start a family, and later, he fought against Floyd Mayweather in boxing. As a result of this, the UFC stripped him of both titles. Well, he's a mixed martial artist at the moment, but reports have it that he might be returning to the UFC this year. So let's see if that happens.
Pure unarmed combat where there is no limitations, but I most certainly would step into his world.
Next on the list is the one and only Jens Pulver. Jens Pulver was a name that was banished for a while from the UFC.
And I still got the UFC banner to do it, so Twitch was the perfect platform.
Well, I'm glad you're here, Jeds, because last night we had the UFC Hall of Fame.
Apparently, 2002 didn't really prove to be a good year for him. That year, he defended his title against BJ Penn at UFC 35, but later, he and the UFC couldn't come to terms since he wanted a new deal. But the issue didn't get resolved, and Pulver eventually left the UFC. After this, he fought for several other promotions, but then he once again returned to the UFC and was ultimately stripped from their titles. And while we're on the topic, the next one will surprise you. BJ Penn also had this kind of issue once. At UFC 46, BJ Penn defeated Matt Hughes, and well, he got the title. But then there was a dirty dispute between him and the UFC, which ultimately led the fighter to leave the UFC and join the K1. And with that, the UFC ultimately stripped him of the welterweight title. It was actually the UFC's loss, since he was actually one of the best fighters in the world at that time. Later in 2006, Penn and the UFC resolved the matter, and the fighter eventually returned to fight again. With that, the last one on this list is also quite a surprising one. It's Francis Ngannou. Just recently, Francis Ngannou was stripped of his title, and he's now all free to sign with any other combat sports promotion.
I want to thank the UFC fan who have supported me during this time.
This all happened after a year-long dispute, and fans were actually waiting for this to happen for a long time. Ngannou was accused of wanting to fight lesser opponents, but for a lot more money, and Dana White stated that if he wanted that, he could do it outside of the UFC.
He doesn't want to take a lot of risk. Feels like he's in a good position where he could fight lesser opponents and make more money.
On top of that, he's been recovering from the injury and was to compete against another fighter in March. But, well, nothing's happening now, and I wonder what other contract he'll sign now. Some believe that he might end up becoming a free fighter. For the past 2 years, the UFC couldn't make him agree on anything at all. Fans wonder if he'll be able to settle with any other promotion easily. Let's wait and watch. And that's all for today. We'll be back with more soon. See you in the next one.